I am so thankful that Pride was yesterday. It felt so good to be out walking, to see so many people along the route. I didn't realize until this morning that yesterday was actually the 5-month anniversary of the Pulse tragedy. And I thought, look at God marking the 5 months with a celebration of pride. These last few months have been filled with shock, with pain, with fear. The parade offered a place of healing for me. I hope it was the same for those who are able to walk and those along the route. Will you please join me in prayer? Holy and loving God, help us to quiet the distractions of the world around us. Help us to be still and to know you. May our focus always be on you and what you have prepared for us. More than anything, we long to hear from you. Dear God, I give you my words. Use them and use me in whatever way you need. I am your servant. May the meditations of our hearts always be pleasing to you. You are our rock and our redeemer, and it is in your many names of love that we say, Amen. These last 5 months, life has dramatically changed in Orlando. And with Tuesday's election, there is more change on its way. Yet, in the midst of all the change, the one thing that will not change, the one piece of certainty in this very uncertain world that we live in, is God's presence in our lives. Psalm 46:10 promises, God is our strength and our refuge, a very present help in the time of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will keep it, will help it when the morning dawns. Now, we are in the middle of a sermon series. I'm sorry, this is like really distracting for me, so I'm going to just move over here so I'm not looking down. So we are in the middle of a sermon series. You'll get through this. That Reverend Terry began this series sharing how sometimes life pits are of our own doing, and other times it's others who have put us in the pit. Sometimes it's friends. Sometimes it's family members. But when we find ourselves in one of life's pits, we must trust that the pit is never the final place. That God sticks with us no matter what. And that what others may have meant for evil, God works for good. We've learned that having a 3-point anchor in Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer allows us to trust in God's destiny and protection for us. That God provides us with a foundation that allows us to bounce back from whatever may knock us down, even when elections don't turn out like we had hoped. We will bounce back. We will celebrate pride. We will not live in fear. We will continue to take the doors off the church and the church to the streets. Now more than ever, God is calling us to be the church. We will continue to celebrate all people just as God created them, in God's image, knit by the hand of God in our mother's wombs. Fighting for what's right is worth it. Let us not grow weary. Let us not lose heart. If we stand together, our best days are ahead. We will bounce back. My yoga practice last Monday, the instructor shared these words that have resonated with me all week. She said, living in the future produces anxiety. Living in the past produces depression. It's only living in the present that brings peace. And all it requires is that we breathe. The Reverend Quinn Caldwell, a UCC pastor, puts it this way: I seem to spend half of my time dwelling on past mistakes and poking at old wounds to see if they still hurt. The other half I spend either plotting for desirable futures or worrying about undesirable ones. And since I'm not God, the time I spend in the past and in the future is time I'm not spending in the here and now. I'm not noticing my kids or my husband or my very own heartbeat. And I bet I'm missing a lot of good stuff. He goes on to say, today I am committing not to be God. I'm committing to being present in the now, at least for a little while. I'm going to do nothing but notice where I am, to look at the gifts of God in the moment that I'm inhabiting instead of the ones that I'm not. I will breathe. I will inhabit. I will be human. And I will be grateful. I will breathe. Just breathe. Be still and know that I am God. One of the many benefits of yoga is that it teaches the importance of breathing, of learning to still the mind and focus on your breath. You see, when one gets on their mat, the only really requirement is to breathe. The poses, the twists, the inversions, while they all have added benefit, what is most important to the practice of yoga is being conscious of one's breath. And by focusing on one's breath, one is able to do poses that you would never imagine yourself doing. It's a lot like my relationship with God. If I think about what I'm being called to do, I get overwhelmed. How could and why would God call someone like me? It makes no sense. But like the challenging poses on my yoga mat, when I quiet my mind, when I simply breathe in God and breathe out all the fears and the doubts, I realize that I just need to be patient with myself and patient with God. I need to be still and trust that God is God and that God is with us. In a recent devotion that I read, the author shared a story of when she was 5 years old. It was picture day at school, and her mom was helping her brush her teeth. Now, being an independent 5-year-old, she insisted that she could do this herself. She writes, "It took approximately 2.5 seconds for me to drop a huge glob of toothpaste on my new dress. And my mom sent me to school with a smiling face and a huge white stain in the center of my chest." My first school picture is my favorite school picture because it was my first real lesson in the wisdom of patience. So many of us share the kryptonite of the just let me do it myself spirit. In James 5:7, we are reminded that there is reaping in the waiting. Farmers must spend as much time planting as they do waiting, and both are equally important to the process of growth. Maybe it's time we slow down and let God have our toothbrushes. We might just hear a word from God. We might realize that we should go left instead of right. We might just realize how much wisdom can be found in the waiting. Now, patience and being still is difficult for me. As many of you know, I love to run. And my favorite quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. What I've learned in these last few months, sometimes moving forward means being still. Last August, 3 of my running friends invited me to participate in a challenge of hiking 100 miles in the Smoky Mountain National Park. Now, 2 of them had already completed their 100 miles, and the third had only a few miles to go. And I was starting at 0 and would only have 2 long weekends to complete these 100 miles. Keep in mind, I had never hiked more than a few miles at a time prior to this challenge. Now, while I doubted that I would ever get near 100 miles in that time frame, I do love a good challenge. And if they were willing to spend the amount of time for me it would take to get to the 100 miles, well, I had to say yes. I mean, it would be rude not to. That first weekend in August, we got to 55 miles. And 6 weeks later, we got in the remaining 45. And as much as I enjoyed moving forward each step on the trail, and I was very thankful for every mile that we clicked off, the moments that I remember the most are the moments where we stopped. The moments where we were still and took in all the beauty that surrounded us. When we reached 98 miles, we were deciding where to hike those last 2 miles. My friends found a mile out and back trail that was close by. We set out. Some other friends joined in. We hiked the mile out, and I was so excited on that last mile. I was leading the pack. As we were celebrating the finish, one of my friends happened to notice, up on a hill, hidden by trees, was a small country church. God had taken me 100 miles and led me home to church. It was time to be still and to know that God is God. Now, when my friends had suggested this 100-mile challenge, I never for a moment believed that it would be possible. You could say that I had forgotten that with God, all things are possible. And when you're blessed with the very best of friends, well, the journey is even more amazing. I was reminded that God sticks with us, especially when the path ahead seems daunting and impossible. Sometimes that path is a 100-mile hike. Or maybe it's the election that we didn't turn out as we expected. Maybe it's battling an addiction or a need to practice self-care. Sometimes the path may be the end of a relationship, or maybe it's the beginning of a relationship that you have longed for, but because of the hurt that you've experienced in the past, you are scared to death to open yourself up to anyone. Perhaps the path is the end of a job, an unwanted diagnosis, the betrayal of a friend, or the death of a loved one. And sometimes the path may be dealing with the aftermath of an individual that was hurting so much that he went into a nightclub and killed 49 souls and injured so many others. Whatever the path we find ourselves on, remember, while the nations are in an uproar and kingdoms totter, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. God tells us in those moments, be still and know that I am God. The Message translation puts it this way: step out of the traffic. Take a long, loving look at me, your high God, above politics. How appropriate for these past few months. Above everything. I love that image of stepping out of traffic and taking a long, loving look at God. Traffic is all around us in one form or another, and most days it feels like it's coming right at us. But in Joshua 1:9, we receive another guarantee. God not only tells us, but commands us to be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Wherever you go. Whatever the path, God is with you. I recently heard someone talk about his time as a lifeguard. He explained that it was always a concern when someone larger than himself needed rescuing. The concern being that the person would pull him down as he attempted to rescue the person in trouble. As a lifeguard, he had to wait for the person to get to the point where they had no strength left. It was only when the person was so weak and couldn't fight anymore and was grasping for that final breath that the lifeguard could pull the person to safety. God is our lifeguard. It's time to stop struggling. It's time to let go of control and instead just be held. To let God be God. A few weeks ago, I had to put down my 17-year-old dog, Reggie. This was especially difficult. Reg. This was especially difficult because God had used that pup to begin the transformation that continues in me today. And God used that little guy to teach me so many lessons in those 17 years. Even in his final moments of life, God was using him to teach me. Like me, my dogs are huggers. Like they really have a choice living with me. When it was time to let him go, I asked the vet if I could just hug on him. My vet is the best. She said, "We will make whatever you need work." Now, these last few years, Reggie's arthritis had gotten really bad, and so hugging became more and more uncomfortable for him. Whenever I would try to hold him, he would struggle and squirm away. But that morning, he didn't struggle in my arms. He just let me hold him as he took those final breaths. It made me wonder, how many times does God just want to hold us? And instead, we are trying to do things our own way, trying to brush our own teeth. Or maybe it just hurts too much to be held. I often think that I don't have time to be still. There's so much to do, and I'm so busy being busy. It took hiking 100 miles and letting go of my sweet pup to make me realize that when life is coming at us faster than we can handle, when there are mountains and giants in front of us that seem overwhelming, those are the very moments, more than any other, that we need to just breathe. To be still. To know that God is God. And to just be held. Amen.